All right. Hello. Good afternoon to everyone. Good afternoon to us all. And welcome to the Shannon Lecture Series in History. You are all warmly welcome to the spring virtual edition of the Shannon Lecture Series 2022. My name is Stephen Osei Owusu, and I am a PhD candidate and a graduate research assistant at the Department of History, Carleton University. And I must also say that I'm a keen advocate and enthusiast of the environment. And fortunately, this afternoon, we are going to be having talks on the environment and its history. Before we proceed, let me first say that this presentation happening at both Carleton University and the University of Cape Coast in Ghana acknowledges the location of Carleton University on the traditional unceded territories of the Algonquin Nation. And that additionally, I'm also hosting this edition from the University of Cape Coast, located within Cape Coast, the town of Cape Coast, a ceded territory of the Fetu people of Ghana. And before we also proceed, permit me to give special thanks to people that have contributed so much to having this lecture series happening. We want to thank the generous donor of the Shannon Fund, that is Lois Long, whose donation has made the Shannon Lectures possible since 2002 and contributed to numerous graduate scholarships. We equally would want to thank the Shannon Fund Committee of the Department of History, Carleton University, the department chaired by Professor James Milner, and the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences for their generous support. Finally, we are also indebted to the support and sponsorship of the following schools, departments, and institutes in Carleton University. And here in no particular order, permit me to mention some of these institutes, departments, and schools that have provided numerous forms of support to us. First on the list, we have the Department of Sociology and Anthropology. We have the School of Indigenous and Canadian Studies, the Institute of Political Economy, the Department of Geography and Environmental Studies, the Institute of Environmental and Interdisciplinary Science, and last but certainly not least, the Institute of African Studies, We are honored today to be hosting one professor in history, Professor Jason Colby, who is himself into the studies of the environment, specifically marine history. Professor Jason Colby is a professor of history. He holds a BA from Whitman. He also holds an MA and a PhD from Cornell. And like I mentioned, he's a professor and chair of the Department of History from the University of Victoria. And he's the one that we have the honor of being on the seat today to share his talk on the environment with us. And this is the order of the lecture for today. Professor Jason Colby is going to have between 25 to 30 minutes to deliver his presentation. And after that, between 20 minutes to 25 minutes roughly for our Q&A session. And these would be collected and read to the speaker through the chat box. You're also permitted to address these questions to the presenter through the Q&A function of the Zoom platform. If you look at underneath your screen, you would see that in there. And so without much ado, let's humbly welcome Professor Jason Colby to deliver his talk for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen, and it's a real honor to be presenting in the Shannon Lectures, and to thank you all for joining me virtually today. I would normally be in Victoria, but I'm actually coming from rainy Chilliwack, from the traditional territories of the Stalo Nation, and so I'm honored to be on those lands this morning. As advertised, I'm going to focus my talk on BC orcas and Alberta oil, and try to make some suggestive connections and maybe offer some provocative questions, many of which are really the first. This is the first time I've thrown these out publicly, and so I look forward to some feedback in the dialogue between history and current policy and politics here. Over the past decade, especially, these two regional symbols, I guess we could call them, the orcas of BC and the oil of Alberta, these symbols and the values that they represent have come up in debates over Canadian energy and environmental policy. The flashpoint, certainly in that time period, was the expansion of the Trans Mountain Pipeline, which carries oil from Edmond to Burnaby through the Fraser River watershed. Initially proposed by Texas pipeline owner Kinder Morgan in 2013, the project, after much debate and controversy, and I'll get to that a little bit later, was ultimately bought by the Canadian government in 2018.
Sorry, Prof. Jason Colby, sorry, if you are using your slides, we are yet to see these.
Oh, sure thing. Yes, we can definitely start with the slides. This transaction, the sale of the pipeline, and which was proposed to be expanded, the purchase of it by the Canadian government raised public and policy concerns, among them that the pipeline's new owner was the very entity in it charged with protecting the coastal environment, including an endangered population of orcas on the West Coast. And I suppose this is where I come in, both as a historian and sometimes as a participant in the debate. In these same years, 2013 to 2018, I was researching the historical and changing human relationships with killer whales, with this apex predator, Orcinus orca. Now, historically, these had varied around the world. Orcas occur, all around the world, and had all kinds of different varied interactions with human beings, especially, of course, coastal cultures. These interactions had often included respect and coexistence among some indigenous cultures, and even human orca cooperative whaling in a couple of examples. But certainly the main theme in human perceptions and interactions with killer whales was fear and human violence, the human violence toward orcas that fear often brought, much in the same way that fear of and perceptions of wolves and other terrestrial predators had brought that kind of violence. This became more pronounced in the first half of the 20th century. I'll just give you a little glimpse of a comical view of the kind of fears this generated. This is a cover of Stag magazine in late 1953. You see a terrifying orca here spilling these men from this life raft into the water. And this was really the optic, and it's an optic that drove a lot of violence, including even U.S. military sorties to machine gun orcas in the North Atlantic off of Iceland. Yet, in an astonishingly brief span of time, beginning in the mid-1960s, humans went from fearing to loving this apex predator. The epicenter of that transformation is the region that I'm coming to you from, the Salish Sea, as it's often called now. And the driving force behind this, even though this seems shocking to claim to a lot of people today, the driving force behind this was actually live capture and captivity itself, which transformed both popular and scientific views and scientific access to the species. And I'll just give you a little glimpse of these sort of close and intimate encounters and think about the difference in optics here from that Stag magazine cover. This is just sort of suggestive of the history I delve into in the book, but you can see this image of a young trainer hand feeding the very first captive orca in Vancouver. This quite a different optic of the very first instance that anyone had ever seen a human being swim with an orca, and this image of bonding and friendship rather than sort of terror and violence that had often come with it. Now, these encounters over the next decade, certainly into the mid-1970s, were profoundly transformative on lots of people. Among them were future Greenpeace activists. There's an image here of Greenpeace leader Bob Hunter having was a profound encounter with a captive orca in Vancouver that prompted him and many other Greenpeacers to really become the messiahs of the anti-whaling movement and play a critical role in ending commercial whaling. These encounters with these close encounters and this access to this once feared predator also really drove a revolution in scientific research on orcas, including playing a role in, not being the only reason this developed, but playing a role in the development of a photo identification system by researchers based in British Columbia that allowed them to identify and track individual orcas, and eventually, because of that, identify their family groupings, their pods, the matrilineal structures of those pods, and so on, much of what we know now. Among other findings scientists and researchers made was that most of the captures that had occurred in the 1960s and 1970s had targeted a small population that frequents the US and Canadian waters on the West Coast, including a core of their territory being in the Salish Sea. These researchers named them the southern resident killer whales. And as I argue in my book, they are the most influential population of cetaceans in human history. As the researchers determined over the next following years and decades, among other things, that the southern residents rely almost entirely on salmon, and specifically Chinook salmon, for their food as their prey item. The Chinook salmon, the largest but rarest of the Pacific salmon species. Now, the southern residents, we think, as late as perhaps 1850 or 1860, may have numbered as many as 300 individual animals. But the transformations of the ecosystem, the marine and coastal ecosystem, wreaked havoc on the prey that supplied them, Chinook salmon. Damming, logging, and fishing devastated the large Sacramento and Columbia River runs that they relied on in US waters. Just give you a little glimpse of this. This is a shot of industrial fish traps right off of Canadian territorial waters, but these are American industrial fish traps scooping up just extraordinary volumes of salmon runs, and an image of one of the first major dams on the Columbia River system, the Bonneville Dam, which had a profound impact on salmon runs, including Chinook salmon runs. As a result of this damage, certainly in their southern range, the southern residents came to rely, certainly by the 20th century, in the second half of the 20th century, relied disproportionately on, and precariously, I would say, on the Chinook runs that come to the Fraser River in BC territory, in BC waters. In the 1980s and 1990s, as whale watching boomed, the southern residents recovered from around 74, 75 individuals to nearly 100 individuals by the year 2000. But in the early 2000s, they started to decline. With concern growing, public and media concern, and scientific concern growing, the US government listed the southern residents, as well as several Chinook salmon runs in Washington state waters, under the US Endangered Species Act. And an overall recovery plan is released by the US government in 2005. Things moved somewhat more slowly in Canada, but in 2008, the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, the DFO, released its own recovery plan. And to some degree, there was coordination and cooperation between researchers and regulators on both sides of the border. So to make a long story short, and this is certainly a much longer story I detail in my book, by the time the Trans Mountain expansion was proposed in 2013, the people of the Salish Sea, indigenous and settler alike, were deeply invested in the southern residents and their place in the region and their place in the local marine ecosystem. The southern residents had, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say, become woven into and really central to the region's identity, culture, and tourist industry. So then, of course, along comes the Trans Mountain pipeline proposal. The proposal raised a number of issues. Indigenous sovereignty, through the lands through which the expanded pipeline, the work could be done on. Impact on watersheds, especially the Fraser River watershed. Marine ecosystem damage, potential of oil spills, certainly marine acoustic pollution, marine noise. But for many of these, the southern residents became an easy and effective symbol to really crystallize and focus together the multiple threats that this expansion posed, especially since, as many noted, the expansion would increase the number of tankers visiting the Burnaby terminal from 60 per year to 400 per year. Opposition, especially in BC, was fierce. And in 2018, after years of protests, lawsuits, and verbal and policy sniping between the premiers of BC and Alberta, which included Alberta briefly banning BC wine, the Canadian government decided to buy the pipeline from Kinder Morgan, promising to push forward with the project, but also promising to fund research on the threats that were faced by the southern residents, and promising to, in fact, send unprecedented funding to research on them. But Ottawa's purchase aroused new fears. Now, the very owner of the pipeline, the owner of this infrastructure project that posed a potential environmental threat, was the same entity overall, the federal government, responsible for evaluating the environmental threat posed by that project, including the threat to local orcas. Concern only grew when Ottawa awarded the research funding primarily not to established killer whale researchers, of whom there were many in BC, but rather to a marine biologist who had not focused on the species at all and had very little experience in framing and running research on the southern residents. Almost immediately and bizarrely, this researcher began giving presentations, including some in Victoria, making claims about the public's misunderstandings of the threats and the status, or threats posed to and the status of the southern residents, many of which clashed with the views of established experts on the species. Now, initially, I've got to admit, most of this was off my radar, those presentations and such. When the sale, when the purchase by the Canadian government of the pipeline occurred, it was literally the same month when my book had come out and I had started on a book tour, mostly in the US. That summer, of course, in 2018 was the summer when Tahlequah, a young mother among the southern resident orcas, captured the attention of not just the region, but the world by pushing her dead calf around the Salish Sea for days. And a scene that had a profound emotional impact on people around the world. While that was going on, Canadian courts actually quashed the pipeline expansion project and sent it back to Canada's National Energy Board, the NEB, raising the hopes of many, certainly raising the hopes of many activists that the project would be defeated. But in June 2019, the NEB came back with another ruling, which again approved the project. And in doing so, it stated this, quote, "The increase in marine vessels associated with the project would further contribute to cumulative effects that are already jeopardizing the recovery of the southern resident killer whales. And while these effects weighed heavily in the NEB's consideration of project-related marine shipping, the NEB recommends that the Government of Canada find that they can be justified in the circumstances in light of the considerable benefits of the project and the measures to minimize the effects." So in effect, the NEB conceded that the expansion, including the increased vessel traffic that it would entail, indeed presented a legitimate addition to the risks posed to this already critically endangered population, but essentially said, but we're going to go ahead with this anyways because of the national benefits. Now, it isn't surprising that the National Energy Board would come down on the side of a national energy project over the fate of an endangered population, even a beloved endangered population of the West Coast. But this wasn't actually just a national question. the southern residents are not just a Canadian population of orcas. They share international, or they share waters, US waters, including those of Washington State, where several indigenous nations and the state government in Olympia called on Ottawa to change its mind, about the pipeline, pointing out that the Washington State and the US government itself were pushing a range of measures to try to support the recovery of the southern residents, but that all could be for naught if this project went through. So that July 2019, just a few weeks after the NEB's ruling, the CBC decided to do a big story on this in BC, and it interviewed the lead researcher that had received this federal funding and who had sort of been making presentations from the beginning, and they also invited me to respond to this interviewer's statement in a series of 9 interviews that were broadcast at CBC stations around BC. And this biologist, this federally funded biologist, was recorded as saying this, quote, "If it wasn't for the pipeline and the controversy around it, nobody would be talking about southern resident killer whales today. It is really the public discussion connecting killer whales to the pipeline that has all of British Columbia and most of the world now paying attention to their welfare." He went on to emphasize that the discussion around the pipeline had led the government to consider a range of other measures, mitigating measures, including retrofitting vessels and requiring lower speeds in critical areas to reduce marine noise. And as he sort of concluded his statement, he declared, quote, "None of this would have happened without the pipeline." Now, in the interview, I'll just give you a quick synopsis of my response, but I want to walk through this a little bit more. In the interview, I responded that these claims were actually only half right. I emphasized that I certainly conceded that while the discussion over the pipeline had brought a great range of proposals about mitigating measures to reduce the harm, that it was ahistorical, fundamentally ahistorical, to state that people cared about orcas on the West Coast only due to the pipeline. I was sort of stunned to hear that. Interest had been growing for more than 40 years, really 50, 55 years. I knew that because I had just written a book about it. Now, this researcher, who hadn't read my book, immediately emailed me right after these interviews, clearly upset by how I'd responded, and sent me a long email sort of substantiating his claims. Among these, he claimed that he had funded a study, a media study, quantifying the stories on, quote, southern resident orcas in what he described as, quote, local newspapers. The study quantitatively confirmed, he declared, that public interest had been minimal until the proposal of the pipeline, citing the fact that the stories using that phrase in their title and in the lead were almost nil until the Trans Mountain Pipeline in 2013. Now, I think we all know that historians, or we should concede that historians shouldn't make scientific claims. For example, I shouldn't be standing on a beach in San Juan Island and see a gathering of the 3 pods of southern residents that happens, once a year in the summer, and be seeing 75 animals and say, looks like the population is fine. I see a bunch of them right here. I'm not trained as a scientist in those methods, and I'm not trained to make those claims. But what do we do when a scientist makes a historical claim? Now, obviously, I would have preferred that he had read my book, but really, the problems with the newspaper study were profound. I mean, he seriously flawed. He had only searched for exactly that phrase, southern resident orcas, even though on both sides of the border, there's a full range of phrases, and this has changed over time, as we know, phrasing changes over time. But he had also looked only at the newspapers to which his institution had subscribed, and had completely excluded almost all US newspapers, including all of them in the Pacific Northwest. So the study essentially was useless for answering the question that he had posed. But in terms of policy alone, he also should have known better. By 2008, as I just detailed, 5 years before the proposed expansion of the pipeline, both the United States and Canada had announced recovery plans for the southern residents. And these recovery plans driven by not just scientific concern, but public and media concern. But it got even weirder because he also made a scientific claim in his email to me that even this historian could tell was flawed scientifically. He declared that the southern residents had always been a small population, never, at least in the 20th century, more than 70 something. And so the argument that they were critically endangered and crashing was seriously flawed. And he made this argument that this went back, sort of drawing upon a model someone else had done, that this showed, all the way back into the 1960s and early 1960s and 1950s, that the population was only around, 70 something. Now, he had made this claim before, and it had puzzled experts at the time. After all, the southern residents weren't identified as a discrete population until the late 1970s. And there were, in fact, no even rough data points about the numbers of orcas on the West Coast until the initial rough censuses started in the 1970s. So there's no data actually to support this claim that they were always a small population. And moreover, the population's genetic diversity and the historical Chinook runs that had been depleted both indicated that there was very likely a higher population in the past. Now, to be clear, we should never, ever dismiss a researcher in any field for questioning assumptions, questioning an accepted paradigm, and even engaging in contrarian thought. But what I would suggest when this becomes problematic is when the researcher in question, in this case, the scientist in question, is out of step with the consensus of other scientists, other experts, and that same scientist is being funded by the owner of the project in question. I certainly found myself asking, essentially, when I received this email and sort of engaged in this email exchange, why in the world was he even asking this question? Why in the world would he, a scientist assigned to evaluate the status and threats to the southern residents, why would he use some of that funding to prove that public interest was low until recently? And also, why was it so important to him to show on the basis of faulty data or non-existent data that the population was always small? Was this about studying the threats to this population, or was it about claiming and establishing that public concern about the southern resident orcas was in fact a red herring, fake, not really the reason for opposition to the pipeline? Now, the stances of Alberta and Ottawa are easier to understand politically. Ottawa has many priorities it's trying to balance, including the national economy, environmental protections, and the need for Alberta's cooperation with the proposed federal climate change policy. From Alberta's perspective, and this was sometimes entertaining, the exchange between Alberta and BC, but from Alberta's perspective, this was just about having an outlet for its oil, about being able to export its product. As BC residents heard again and again from residents and the premier of Alberta, Alberta had, they declared over and over again, the right to, quote, get our product to Tidewater. Get our product to Tidewater. We need to get our product to Tidewater. Now, as a lifelong resident of the West Coast and, a former fisher myself, growing up and having lived on and around the water, I found myself perpetually perplexed by this term, Tidewater. Tidewater, they keep using this term, Tidewater. People who live on the coast don't use that word. We never use that word. What do they mean by that? Of course, sort of embarrassingly and belatedly, it occurred to me, okay, they just mean saltwater. They mean large water with tides. And of course, that meant, Tidewater is our transportation outlet. Saltwater is our transportation outlet to get our product to overseas markets. And so that's the way they're viewing the coastal ecosystem. From Alberta's perspective, BC's concerns, including for the southern resident orcas, were, I think, to some degree, understandably alien and almost inexplicable. These are just obstacles that don't seem to justify opposing this infrastructure plan. But as I like to point out, for the people and the marine life of the West Coast, certainly the correct term would not be tidewater, it would be home. Right? This is where we all live, and these infrastructure projects aren't just passing, don't just require transportation through our homelands and our home waters. They affect them. Now, in closing, I'd like to emphasize that the outcome of Canada's decision to buy this pipeline, to push forward the expansion, to fund the research that seemed to justify this expansion, and to ultimately prioritize resource extraction over environmental protection, this isn't inevitable. And in fact, my current project I'm working on now really sort of traces this as a very different outcome. I'm currently researching the near extinction and extraordinary recovery of Eastern Pacific gray whales, which migrate annually from the Bering Sea to Baja, Mexico, to their calving lagoons and mating lagoons in Baja, Mexico. When American whalers discovered their calving lagoons in the 19th century, the population nearly died off, and really by the early 20th century, many experts thought it was either extinct or about to be extinct. But with protections beginning in the 1930s and their own characteristics as a adaptable coastal species, Eastern Pacific gray whales have recovered to nearly historical numbers. In the 1990s, news came that Mitsubishi in Japan was planning to develop a new salt complex in San Ignacio Lagoon, the last really nearly pristine calving lagoon in Baja that this population of gray whales uses. An international effort of scientists and activists, including lots of Canadian and US, as well as Mexican and journalists, activists, researchers, mobilized to oppose the project. And a key part of their efforts was the fact that gray whales have a particular and unique role and behavior in these calving lagoons, which is they actually will come up to small boats and visit them and even allow people on the boats to touch them. A unique phenomenon that is known as the friendly whales of Baja. And you'll see a picture of your current speaker getting a chance to do that. Now, these encounters, these intimate encounters, these friendly encounters with these whales who are not looking for food, they're just coming up to sort of visit, ultimately played an extraordinary role in convincing the Mexican president in 2000, after he and his family and kids visited and got a chance to have this encounter, convinced him to cancel this project, even though it represented a significant loss of investment and foreign investment in the salt industry. And it shows, I want to emphasize, that a country poorer than Canada, relatively, made the courageous decision to choose ecological coexistence over resource extraction. And I think I'll end right there, but I keep mentioning my book, so I guess I'll give a little plug as we do Q&A to show you. If you're interested in learning more about what I just hinted at the beginning, there's the book. So thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Jason Colby, for that wonderful presentation. So we are now at a stage where we are taking questions from participants. I could see some questions already slotted in the chat box. So just a minute, let me fetch some of these for you, Professor Colby. The first question we have is from Dominique, and it says, if there is no, okay, she's asking essentially if you could interrogate the idea of how and why the early researcher was hired with little experience in the biology of orcas. Why are his peers allowing him to carry one? Professor Colby?
That's a great question. And I don't have any internal insight into the decision to contract this particular researcher, but I will say this. My guess is that those who made this decision, including the National Energy Board that had input on this, wanted a researcher who had a history of being fairly friendly to businesses and corporate ventures, certainly in the region, rather than someone who had focused primarily on the dangers and protections to the species. And I think the argument at the time was well, we'll get somebody with fresh eyes who has an infrastructure that can really build a large scale research program. The downside for that was that the team ended up in many ways replicating some of the research that had already been done on both sides of the border. In fact, one of the frustrations of US researchers was that it felt like it was just a duplication of much of their work. And on the BC side of the border, I'll just say that those who had made careers out of really building an extraordinary expertise and revealing the nuanced life cycles and food cultures and ecological cultures of the southern and northern resident orcas were not really brought into the study in a way that one might expect, perhaps because they would be expected to oppose the program or oppose the proposal.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Prof. There's one more question from Tim. Tim is asking, thanks, Doc Colby, for a great talk. You mentioned the transnational nature of the southern resident orca population, that is between the US and Canada, and the protestations of Washington officials regarding the Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain Pipeline, possible pollution, marine noise, etc. I'm wondering if we can consider this the limit of national energy policy. That is, in a world where externalities of energy policy are increasingly felt globally, can we consider southern residents a site of contestation regarding national versus transnational energy policy?
That's a terrific question. And I think there's a case to be made often for how globalization and has weakened the sovereignty of the nation state to the point where it's harder to impose labor protections and environmental protections. Certainly that's a critique of the North American Free Trade Agreement, for example. On the flip side, though, you can see that on environmental questions, both energy and environmental kind of protection questions, these almost inevitably transcend borders, and it's incredibly difficult to address these questions if you only look at them in a national context. And I guess my concern about the scientific work on this was that it was framed in such a way that seemed to reflect the strictly national lens that the Canadian government itself seemed to be evaluating and thinking about the project in this way, rather than understanding that of course, the ocean itself, but the Salish Sea certainly, and this iconic population, the southern residents, were inherently not a Canadian question or just an American question, but a transnational question, and it would have to require cooperation. Now, this can turn into a bit of a tit for tat, partly because protections of marine space, including fisheries and such, work differently in the United States and Canada. I mean, there's much more co-governance with Indigenous nations in the United States on the West Coast than there is in Canada. There's more state control and such. But ultimately, I think it's dangerous to frame these things in a national way, both in terms of energy policy, but if you think about environmental policy, it's very easy for a Canadian researcher, for example, to say, well, yeah, this might affect the Fraser watershed, which is critical to their food now, but the United States, is responsible for denuding and destroying their food bases in the Sacramento and the Columbia. So it's not just our problem. We shouldn't have to pay the price as Canadians for a problem that the Americans helped create through their own environmental damage. And there's a lot of truth to that, but that requires cooperation, not sort of just nationalizing the regulation in the way we frame it and think about it. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Prof, too, for answering the first few ones. There is one more, and that is a question from Stephen. He's asking, this researcher's work sounds profoundly unethical. Is there any mechanism for ethics review of publicly funded research?
That's a really good question, and I was trying to be suggestive more than definitive, in the sense that I don't know all the ins and outs here, but part of what I wanted to raise, I mean, there are certainly ways in both public forum and in feedback from the public and among peers who can to raise this question of whether the methods of the researcher are sound. what bothered me more is, when we think about these things in a private context, we would never believe, we would never trust, Exxon to do our review of the impact of, oil and carbon emissions on climate change. I mean, that there's an inherent and historical conflict of interest there, and certainly, researchers and scientists who have often worked for private corporations have been accused of being shills for those private corporations, been accused of trying to undermine scientific consensus around things like climate change. And I would suggest that there's a danger of that even for something as large and complex as the Canadian federal government, in the sense that, as a researcher, and I don't have to deal with this as a historian, I have the freedom of framing my own questions, partly because I don't need as much funding to do my research, but there is the concern of, when a scientific researcher takes a large amount of funding from a government that has a vested interest in a stated policy interest in a project, isn't it likely that researcher might frame questions and come to conclusions that lean toward that, even if they're not consciously aware?
Okay, all right, thank you, Prof.
I think there are also
I'm
questions in the Q&A, Stephen, too.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, this is from Son Kiraj. He says, "Hi Jason, great presentation. Did you find any connections between the recent TMPL expansion debate and concerns over tanker oil spills on the West Coast in the 1970s and 1980s that may also have included concerns over orcas or other marine wildlife?"
Well, I would say that I would expect to, and I was disappointed not to see more, at least public discussions of the precedent here, because nothing is more predictable than when you have these oil infrastructure projects, whether it's explorations or offshore drilling or transportation of tankers. You're always assured by the corporation in question, entity in question, that there are safeguards in place, that technology is amazing. We have, if in the unlikely event that we have an oil spill, we have extraordinary cleanup capabilities. But that's exactly the same rhetoric that we've always heard, including when I was a kid growing up in the United States and fishing in Alaska commercially. One of the searing events for us was the Exxon Valdez spill in 1989. In a place that in Prince William Sound in Alaska, which devastated the local ecosystem, that's never recovered in more than 30 years, including sending a unique population of mammal-eating orcas on their way to extinction, long-term extinction. So the argument that the increase in tanker traffic from 60 to 400, didn't pose a risk of oil spills or that kind of catastrophic impact, I found implausible historically, because we'd seen this before. And so, Sean, to answer your question directly, I would hope that you would see that connection, but I didn't see it a lot in the debate. There wasn't much history framing that discussion.
Yes, and we have another question from an anonymous texter. He says, "How do you see this dynamic evolving in the future as countries decarbonize and rely less on oil and gas and move to greener technologies, clean tech and renewable energy? Will this change the power dynamics and the story of orcas? If you wrote the same book on orcas in 2050, after net zero is achieved, will the story look vastly different?"
I love the optimism of this question, and I tend to be an optimist, try to be an optimist, and certainly why I looked to the Gray Whale project as a next project, because I think that people need, and I certainly needed, hopeful stories of recovery, stories of nature healing when it has space and time, and certainly young people especially need to hear that. And so I'm hopeful that yes, if I'd written this book in 2050, this could be go one of two ways or multiple ways, but someone wrote this book in 2050, they could be writing a requiem to the Southern residents. Why did they vanish? What happened? Or it could be, a time when the Southern residents are up to 150 individuals or maybe 200 individuals, and we've removed dams and allowed some of our great local waterways to recover and to become more natural again, and to allow these Chinook runs to recover. I mean, there are always, in all kinds of technology and interventions in nature, there are always impacts, and certainly things like the tidal, the harnessing of tidal energy poses threats potentially to gray whale migration, for example, and such. And so these always have implications. But what I will say is that, it's certainly my hope that that decarbonization happens. We go forward with this, and this removes these kind of questions. And I think this is why so many people, and I'll admit myself included, found it hard to reconcile the federal government's claims of both that we needed to expand this pipeline and that it was all part of a general plan for an aggressive climate strategy of Canada's.
Yes, let me take one more question from the Q&A, and I'll go back to Val is asking, the San Ignacio project was not driven or owned by the Mexican government. So what mechanisms can be used up here by pipeline expansion opponents to counter misinformation by said researcher and the government PR machine?
I think that's a great question, and Val is absolutely right that the difference here is obviously that even though the Mexican government had initially licensed and was supportive of this project, that it didn't have as much scratch in the game, so to speak. It wasn't the owner of these expanded salt works. I mean, obviously, on one level, I think it's incumbent upon people to ask questions and speak out when there's a potential conflict of interest in the way that research is being produced. I do, and one critique I have of a group that I otherwise have immense respect for, and these are the sort of the historic founders of orca research, mostly in BC, who are just extraordinary pioneers in transforming not just killer whale, but cetacean science around the world. But I will say that they're a tight-knit group, and even when one of them says things that they find implausible or hard to swallow and even upsetting, they tend to not want to come out and call out or confront a colleague they've known for a long time for being loose with the facts or making claims that aren't sustained by the evidence, because they have these long relationships. And I understand that that's hard, but I would say that for orca researchers who know better, who have been studying this population for closely in a way that I can't relate to, I'm a historian, not a scientist, I would hope that they would be willing to come out and be interviewed and speak back to this. And also I would hope that the media would give them a platform to do that. But what I would also add to that really quickly, Val, is one of the ways that the activists and locals convinced the Mexican government to change its mind was not just about the friendly whale encounters. It was not just about sort of showing the history of gray whales and their recovery, but it was also emphasizing that protecting that lagoon and protecting these whales was an alternative economic option for the region that would actually be healthier for local peoples. And so it went hand in hand with locally supported whale watching and locally owned whale watching and sort of sustainable tourism in a way that meant that locals had economic options besides going to work for the salt industry. And so I do think that that's important, as sort of showing that there are alternatives rather than always ceding the economic ground, saying it's economics versus environmental values. I mean, the environment is a critical environmental or economic resource for us, and certainly that's true in the Salish Sea.
All right, thank you, Prof. There are quite a number of questions here, but we have limited time, so we'll try and do justice to say two of them. Someone is asking, what are your thoughts on the role that public opinion plays in the making of policy for climate change, the environment, and etc. going forward?
I think it's like so many issues, for those who are passionate about that one issue as their primary issue. I mean, they're definitely able and work hard to get their voices heard. But I do think that there's a general problem in the sense that people have lots of issues and lots of things that they worry about and issues they vote on, if you're convinced that voting or supporting a candidate or supporting a policy that's more environmentally sustainable, that helps slow and even reverse climate change, if you're convinced that it's a zero-sum game between that policy and jobs, and economic health, especially considering what everybody's just lived through in the last couple of years, it's hard to get people mobilized unless there's sort of a position of sort of full economic security. It's hard to get them mobilized for pushing ahead on that. I think that certainly people need to continue to sort of make their voices heard, that this is the existential moral question of our time, which I believe it is. But they also need to show, and I think this is where that question about green technologies is important too. They need to show that the path forward for stopping climate change is also the logical path forward for economic and social justice. And if you can make that argument, I think that makes it more powerful.
Okay. Professor Jason, there's another question from, I think it's a follow-up from someone captured as anonymous. He's asking, where do the limits of ecological knowledge, largely based in situations like this on anecdotal evidence, lie when it comes to a project with massive potential damage to marine populations?
Where did the...
Sorry, that question is coming from Tim.
Okay. I'm actually trying to find it here because it's not, so where did the limits of ecological knowledge, okay, a situation like this and anecdotal evidence. I mean, it's hard. I wouldn't say it's just anecdotal in the sense that, I mean, there's very hard data. I mean, this is the most, certainly up until recent times, it was pretty easy to make.
Yes, I'm sorry, Prof. I'm sorry to interrupt. You probably have 2 minutes more to round up your answer.
Okay, I'll just say very quickly that you have to base it on the best science available and project on what might happen with these kind of infrastructure changes. And it is striking to me that there was actually quite a bit of consensus, even including many on the National Energy Board, that this was a potentially existential threat to the southern residents, but they decided to go ahead with it anyways. So sorry, I can't answer that in more depth.
All right. Thank you, Professor Jason Colby, for your wonderful presentation. I believe you could stop sharing screen now. Yes, it's been absolutely wonderful to have you share your presentation with us, and especially the findings from your book project with us. Would want to give you an opportunity to share with us your closing remarks, 30 seconds to a minute, roughly.
I'm sorry, share what? My final thoughts?
Yeah, your final thoughts, your closing remarks, anything special that you want to present.
Absolutely. I mean, I want to thank everybody for coming and for the opportunity to do this talk. And to Stephen, it was a really lovely to, we almost lured Stephen to come study with us at University of Victoria, and Carleton got him instead, but it was lovely to have him reach out and invite me to do this. I guess I say this partly as a historian and certainly as a resident of the coast, but also as a father, when I say I can't emphasize enough how strongly I believe that it is important for all of us, and certainly for young people and for our children, to hear positive, hopeful stories about how things can be redeemed, how nature can heal if it's given time and space. And we have extraordinary examples of this, in my home state, right close to where I grew up. The Elwha River, a relatively small river, but had been dammed for 100 years, has had the dams removed on it. And in contrast to the predictions of many who, opposed that, it has healed. It has, its salmon runs had come back. Chinook salmon are returning there. Chinook salmon that help feed the southern residents are returning there. It's a small scale example of how nature can heal. And so don't feel hopeless. I mean, you can tell kids, and you can believe as we move forward that it is entirely possible, if we make these decisions with this larger view of coexistence, that things can get better. And so thank you for having me.
Thank you very much, Professor Jason Colby. And thank you to all those of us who were able to make time and then attend today's presentation. But and on that wonderful optimistic note, would want to say you are invited to our next presentation as well. But before we sign off, I must announce that we have another presentation coming off on the 10th of June. I would shortly share a slide of that particular presentation, if I could fetch it. No, I don't think I have it, but it is a presentation that is also on fisheries, something to do with marine life, and that is going to be given by Professor Joseph Agrifin. He's also into marine research here at the University of Cape Coast in Ghana. And I'm pretty sure that there are elements of transnationality that are going to be discussed from his presentation. So you are invited to join us when you have the time. Before we sign off, we also want to say a special thank you to our sponsors who have supported us in hosting this particular program. And also to mention a special thank you to Professor Dominic Marshall, who is the chair of the Shannon Endowment Committee and actually has been a supporting partner in convening this particular lecture series. We are most grateful to her for her support. And so our next lecture session, like I mentioned, is on the 10th of June. We'll be sending around announcements to that effect. And so you could schedule it within your timetables, and if you can make time, join us for another presentation. On that note, Professor Jason Colby and then our invited attendees, we are so grateful for making time to attend this presentation. Thank you very much. See you on the 10th of June.
Thank you.